This week on Inside Olympia, Attorney General Nick Brown has barely been in office a month. He's already sued the Trump administration 5 times. How is he picking his fights? And what are his priorities beyond challenging the president? The Attorney General is our guest for the full hour.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. He served as counsel to Governor Jay Inslee, as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington, and now he is Washington's new Attorney General. And it's been a busy first month in office, as Nick Brown and his team have moved swiftly to challenge several of President Trump's policies, including his attempt to overturn birthright citizenship. Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, to talk about these legal battles against Trump and his other priorities for the office, is Washington's new Attorney General, Nick Brown. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Congratulations on being elected. And wow, what a month. Let me, and what a start to your term. Let me start with a very direct question, which is in the context of the fact that you are a Harvard-educated attorney, you have served in the U.S. military, you have been a U.S. attorney, and now you are the state's Attorney General. Do you think we are at this point in the midst of a constitutional crisis in this country?
No, we're not right now. At least thus far, with respect to the federal litigation, things are proceeding the way that they should. We have a president taking actions that we and other states across the country believe are illegal or unconstitutional. We're challenging those in court. Courts are having hearings, status conferences, accepting motions, and the like. So right now we are not. We have certainly heard a number of comments from the president, from the vice president, from whatever Elon Musk purports to be this week, that call into question the legitimacy of the court's decisions, that are challenging, if not outright attacking them. And I think we are potentially facing a constitutional crisis if, in fact, they chose to take actions to disregard or ignore the courts. But right now, we're not seeing that. We have lawyers showing up in court representing the president and the Department of Justice, representing the states and other private parties, and those are proceeding accordingly. But we are looking very closely to see what the next steps are. But I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves and say that we're anywhere near a crisis quite yet.
We'll talk about some of the specific cases in a moment, but big picture, what is sort of getting set up here? I imagine some of these cases will likely end up before the U.S. Supreme Court. But what does, say, the next, to the extent you can predict here, what does the next 6 months, say, look like as these cases go through the courts and as these challenges mount?
Well, big picture, I know we're focused principally on the federal litigation. Big picture, the work of the AG's office has nothing to do with what's happening in D.C. 90% of what we're doing, what I'm spending my time on, has nothing to do with Trump or challenging these cases. But as we move forward in these cases, the president in his first few weeks in office has taken, dozens of executive steps, issued dozens of executive orders. We have challenged a small handful of those, and the courts are setting up those schedules according to federal law and federal rules. These are really important issues, right? We're talking about what it means to be an American under our United States Constitution. We're talking about health care for transgender individuals. We're talking about the very funding of state and federal government and the president's actions that I believe are illegal. So many of these issues are the types of issues that I think ultimately will end up in the Supreme Court. Certainly not all of them, but some of the issues that we've taken on thus far, I think ultimately need to be decided by the Supreme Court. But we're right now just at the district court, right? We're in the Western District of Washington, and some of the cases that we've led, we're in other district courts across the country. But at least for a few of these, I anticipate the Supreme Court will ultimately weigh in.
Do you have a thought or an opinion about what the president's strategy is here? What his ultimate goal is?
Look, I have a lot of my own sort of, perspectives on what the president and his team are doing. But I try very hard not to get into the head of the president because the actions don't make sense. And time and time again, I think on all these issues that we've been engaged with thus far, you can have legitimate policy differences on how you want to define citizenship, on who is entitled to health care, on how government programs are funded. but at least from our perspective, the way that the president is going about it are blatantly illegal. The funding challenges, for example, are pretty straightforward from my view. Like Congress said, we are authorizing funding for certain purposes. Many of those statutory laws have specific provisions about how you revise or change those, and the president is essentially ignoring those. It has been the constitutional principle since 1800s that birthright citizenship meant if you were born in America, with limited exception, that you were an American, and the president is ignoring that. So,
although on both those fronts, it may be that the president and his team do want these to go before the Supreme Court again to get revisited.
Yeah, he might. I mean, the Supreme Court has weighed in on birthright citizenship. It's been a while, and I think that he is taking actions in a way that ultimately he hopes get to the Supreme Court. But we feel really confident in our cases that we will prevail in these matters. But there is no rhyme or reason quite often to what President Trump are doing, and I don't think it's part of a big master strategy. I think he's just putting everything out there and seeing what sticks.
So as we speak, your office has either initiated or joined with 5
Correct.
lawsuits, and to date, do you have injunctions in all 5, some of the 5?
We either have an injunction or temporary restraining orders in 4 of the 5. So we led a case on birthright citizenship where we got a temporary restraining order and then an injunction here in Washington. We joined a case on the OMB funding freezes that President Trump put into place that was very quickly subject to a TRO and then an injunction similar with the National Institute of Health. We have a case challenging Elon Musk's authority under the Appointments Clause where we do not have a temporary restraining order, but with that case we'll proceed to the next steps. So in 4 of the 5 cases, the courts have immediately come in and stopped those on a short-term basis.
Do you have any concern that, because we've seen when President Biden was in office, Republican AGs were suing over a lot of his policies. Is there any danger here that we get into an environment or a culture where every time the opposite party has the presidency, the state attorneys general from the opposite party are filing suits challenging the administration's policies, and that ultimately that's not productive?
Well, I don't want to necessarily speak for what Republican AGs did against President Biden because I don't know their rationale. They weren't nearly as successful as Democratic AGs were under the first Trump administration. And I think what we're seeing, at least currently with President Trump, is a real disregard for the law. And so, I get asked quite often, why are you deciding to sue on this and not? And I think the question should be, why is the president continually breaking the law? If he followed the Constitution, if he had these policy debates in the way that they are supposed to happen, if he worked collaboratively with the Congress to change policy, we wouldn't have to litigate. But when you blatantly disregard the Constitution or federal statute, my obligation as the Attorney General to defend the Constitution of the United States and the Washington State Constitution is to challenge these things. And I think it is consistent with the rule of law to do that. To ignore illegal action just because it came from the president, I think would be a real disregard of my duty. And so, I don't want to predict what may happen. I think it's unfortunate, frankly, that we have to litigate so much against the president of the United States. But to choose otherwise would be to ignore the Constitution, and we're just not going to do that.
And if there are Republicans out there saying, oh, these Democratic AGs are playing politics here, or that's what's motivating this, what's your response back?
Well, I think it's kind of silly. In part because I don't think when I see those critiques, we had a critique from the chair of the Republican State Party right after our first case. He clearly had not read our case. He had clearly not read any of the declarations. He clearly had not done any legal analysis. And I think it's real sad and unfortunate where immediately people assume partisanship or politics when you haven't actually reviewed the merits of the case. So I kind of disregard that very quickly. And, again, the opposite would be to ignore what are illegal actions. The opposite would be to not enforce the rule of law. And time again, I've heard from people of both parties, but more specifically Republicans in many years, arguing that we need to return to the rule of law. And if we're going to make that argument, we need to be consistent. So I don't take those criticisms seriously. I think when people criticize me or the office's actions without having reviewed the complaint, It really shows how partisan that they are being in that circumstance, and we continue to just follow our oath, and we'll continue to do that.
Take us behind the scenes a little bit. It's often said the Attorney General runs the largest law firm in the state. How many attorneys are working on these cases? How big is the division that's focused on these lawsuits?
Well, we have one of the biggest Attorney General's offices in the country. So I've got over 800 lawyers that work on issues across the spectrum and across the state. And the cases and the number of people, lawyers, professional staff, they're involved in the federal affirmative litigation is pretty small, actually. And it's spread out through a number of different divisions. So we have a civil rights division that leads a number of these cases, a complex litigation division, but we have lawyers and staff from a number of different divisions that are involved in reviewing the executive orders, researching the legal issues, and preparing cases for filing. So at any given time, it's only a small handful of the overall number of lawyers. And the bread and butter of what we do on a day-to-day basis is not this work. It is the work that gets the headlines. It's because it's against the president. It's more public attention. But it is not what the majority of the office is doing, and it's not what I'm doing for most of my time.
And then also sticking behind the scenes for a moment, I mean, you're new to this office, but obviously the Attorney General office in this state has, in Trump 1.0, sued that administration under Bob Ferguson successfully multiple times, and you're coordinating with attorneys general, Democratic attorneys general in other states. So what does that start to look like? Sort of how much infrastructure and preparation was already in place, and then how do you divide and conquer and coordinate here?
Well, it's been reported in a few different circumstances, but over the past year, Democratic attorney generals across the country and their staffs started to review the statements that were being made by then candidate Trump, by the candidate positions, reviewing Project 2025. President Trump during the campaign essentially disavowed any knowledge or involvement with Project 2025. What we've seen in the first 3 weeks is really a blueprint from that exact document that he proclaimed no knowledge of. But over the past year, our Attorney General's offices across the country reviewed that and got prepared for what we expected in these first few weeks. And so, when the president dropped his executive order around birthright citizenship, for example, that was something that my team had been researching, other offices across the state. And at the staff and Attorney General level, we communicate regularly, sometimes multiple times a week, to make sure that we are not duplicating each other's work. Each AG has their own independent authority, and so I'm always focused on, is this right for Washington? What is Washington's harm or impact from some of these executive orders? We've led on some of these cases. In other cases, we've let other states lead. But that requires and benefits from a great deal of communication across the country. And Washington, a lot of people that are working on our cases were involved in the first Trump litigation. So we've got a lot of expertise. We've got a lot of resources. Not every AG's office in the country has the same number of experience or resources that we do. So I'm really fortunate to have inherited this office with a great deal of experience. But we continue to review those cases independently as well to make sure that we have the best information about how to move forward.
And then can you just tell us a little bit about sort of your test for deciding whether to sue, whether to sign on?
Yeah.
I imagine you cannot swing at every pitch here, right?
Well, we could, but we shouldn't. My test is sort of similar to what then A.G. Ferguson did. Is we first look to see, is this something that's illegal or unconstitutional? Not everything that President Trump does is going to meet that first hurdle.
You've said before you might disagree, but if it doesn't meet that legal test,
there are lots of things that he's done that I think is stupid or bad policy or something that I certainly wouldn't recommend, but it might be perfectly legal. And he could have done or tried to do many of the things that he's done via executive order in a legal way, but he hasn't. But we look to see, is it illegal? Are Washingtonians impacted? Not everything that he does that might be illegal would have the same impact here that it might in another state. And so we look to see, are Washington institutions, organizations, people harmed by this conduct? And then decide whether or not we should be involved in the case or lead a case here. And, again, I don't know how many total executive orders that he's issued in his first few weeks in office, but certainly we've only challenged a very small percentage of those. But they're on big, important things that we believe are illegal and that are harming Washingtonians. And so We'll continue to do that. Each one is very fact-specific. I didn't join every lawsuit that my colleagues have joined, but it's because we reviewed it and looked at those factors to decide whether we should be involved or not.
And to some extent, are you also just having to be smart with resources, that even if you agreed, but you're like, well, they're doing it, and I've got to conserve my folks or our bandwidth?
Not really, because if we do that analysis and we look at those three factors and the answer is yes to all those three cases, then we need to file a case or we need to be involved in a case. I wouldn't want to say this is illegal, it harms Washingtonians, and we have a good venue here to do it, and then say we're just not doing it. So we have the resources. Now we have to be mindful about the hard work that it takes to put in and put together a case. But if we meet those factors, we'll find a way.
So right now, your office has an outgoing voicemail message that acknowledges that people are calling concerned about Doge and specifically about the access to private information that Doge may be getting, that Elon Musk and his team might be getting. What kinds of calls are you getting? What prompted that outgoing message? And help us understand sort of the context for that.
Yeah, it runs the gamut, but at a high level, questions about Doge, about access to private personal information, questions about Elon Musk's authority to do what he and his team of young tech bros are doing. It is by far the number one call we've gotten by exponential factors.
Wow.
Of all the things that President Trump has done, people are expressing concern about what they're doing. And I think in large part that's driven by the personal impact that they're feeling and also the lack of transparency from President Trump and Elon Musk. Like, we know that they're having access to the Department of Treasury, for example. We don't know under what authority. He hasn't been confirmed by the Senate for any Senate-level role. We also don't know, what information they're getting full access to, and that makes people really nervous, and with good reason. You don't want rogue, unconfirmed actors, particularly the richest person in the world, who's not accountable to anybody, to have access to your taxpayer information or your healthcare information or what have you. And so I'm not totally surprised that's generate that so much contact from the public, but it is the number one issue, not only in Washington, but in every state that I've spoken to other AGs. It is the number one question and concern that their constituents are fielding, which I think generates also that it's a bipartisan concern. It's not simply a Democratic concern. It's people of all spectrums worried about their privacy being invaded.
The president's actions also implicate the state budget because we rely on a lot of federal funds. I'm curious what kinds of conversations you're having with now Governor Ferguson, your predecessor, who has some experience in this department of suing the president, but also now has to figure out how to help the legislature balance the budget with a lot of question marks about what's going to happen with federal funding. What kind of conversations are you having? Have you sought his advice? Has he called you to say, go sue on this because it's,
well,
how's this working?
Yeah, I don't want to get too far in the weeds. Well, let me say a few things. One, I've known AG Ferguson when he was AG, when I started as governor's counsel. So we've worked together on a number of things. When I was Governor Inslee's counsel, I was the principal liaison to the AG's office and got to know Bob and his team. When I was U.S. attorney, there were some cases where we collaborated on. I served as a special assistant attorney general in a number of cases when I was in private practice. So we have a good, longstanding working relationship. It's a little different now because not only was he my predecessor, but he's also my client, or the office of the governor is my client. And so there are times where we need to provide them legal advice or guidance on issues. And all of the governor's cabinet agencies, they're all supported by lawyers that work for me.
Sure.
So it's an interesting relationship in that regard, irrespective of who has those positions. And I would just say they've been super helpful in the transition, getting me up to speed, giving me a lay of the land of what I might be walking into. And my staff and the governor's staff are in daily contact on a host of issues, some of which involve President Trump, most of which do not. And so I appreciate that working relationship. And we have real serious budget issues, irrespective of what President Trump is doing. We are facing some real serious budget challenges that we knew about before President Trump took office. And to see what he's doing on top of those issues, compounding the impacts and the harm to people, it's something that we need a lot of coordination with.
I want to ask you, you are the state's first black attorney general, and I want to just ask you to respond to the DEI rollbacks that the president has initiated and his attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion programs throughout the federal government, and also instructing anybody who's getting federal funding to roll back those programs. And we're seeing also sort of a retrenching on the part of corporate America. What's your reaction to, your response to this effort?
Well, let me step back. I'm the first black statewide elected official outside of our Supreme Court. So not just the first black AG, but of any statewide position. And I take that position very seriously for a multitude of reasons, but to be in this position, I also recognize that I'm unique in that regard. The president, not only as president, but as a candidate and as president the first time, has really spent a great deal of his time and energy directing what I view as hatred, bigotry, racism towards people of color, towards immigrants, towards people that are easy to demonize and make the other and make scary and for the American public. And he's done that effectively. He has channeled people's fear of the unknown, the fear of the other, the fear that they're losing some power or influence or place in society to his political benefit. I don't think he does that because he gives a damn about other people. I think he does it for himself. But he has effectively weaponized D&I in the same way. I think he's doing this because it allows him to exert control over more of government and, frankly, the American culture in new ways. DEI, or efforts like that, are a healthy and good thing. We need to be strengthening our workforce. DEI efforts help strengthen our workforce. There's time and time again evidence to show that DEI makes the workforce more inclusive and stronger and more beneficial for the public. But they've turned it into a boogeyman in all sorts of ways. And we're not only seeing that from President Trump, we're seeing that from officials across the country. You know, there was a lawsuit filed last week by 19 Republican attorney generals against Starbucks, proud Washington company, alleging that their DEI policies were illegal. But they didn't simply say they were illegal. They claimed in a federal court case that DEI made longer wait times and higher prices for people in Missouri and other states. I just want people to understand how absurd and ridiculous of a claim that is, that by hiring more women and people of color, black people in particular, that Starbucks has somehow led to higher prices in America. That is offensive in multiple levels, but it is being justified and encouraged by the president. So he's not only threatening to take away funding from agencies or government entities who have DEI efforts, he's also threatening private companies. We've seen a tax against Costco, another proud Washington company. And there used to be a time where Republicans would let private companies do what they wanted to do. That was their mantra, that we should stay out of private corporations' affairs. But when it comes to support for people of color or for women, they somehow have lost their consistency. And it is offensive in many different levels, and it's also hypocritical. So we will continue to do everything we can to defend Washington state law, which is supportive of DEI efforts. We will continue to defend Washington companies who are doing things that are in their best business interest. But to see it come from the President of the United States is really, it's a sad testament of where we're at in America.
Let me just follow up then by asking you to sort of take off your Attorney General hat, and as a newly elected statewide Democrat in this office, in this state, do you have an observation about what your party, what Democrats in this country should be doing differently in how they talk about these issues with the American public?
Well, I think we all need to get better about how we communicate our work. I think we, as a party, but frankly, all elected people, we suffer from thinking people understand what we do on a day-to-day basis. We're down in here in Olympia, and sometimes Olympia, particularly during a legislative session, can feel like the center of the universe. When the vast majority of the public have no idea what's happening down here, they don't really, for the most part, care or have much concern about what's happening here or in Washington, D.C. We need to be able to better communicate about how our work impacts their lives, and we need to be more transparent, both in our successes and victories and also the challenges or defeats that we've had. And so as a party and as an elected official, I need to make sure that I'm doing my best to communicate the day-to-day impact of our work. And time and time again, people again focus on the stuff that we're doing against the Trump administration, but we're also bringing criminal cases, we're also bringing antitrust cases, consumer protection cases, all of these things that I think improve people's lives on a day-to-day basis. And so we have to find better language, better words, and also do work that people care about. And we haven't brought a case challenging the president's DEI executive orders, because at least right now we haven't found that a case was the right approach. But I will continue to speak up and defend what I think are my values, but also the values of Washington State.
Just before we go to break, there are two other issues that are sort of on my mind. One is election security, especially given the cuts, if you will, or the layoffs or the firings that have happened at CISA, the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Agency, which watches for election-related threats. I know we're not in the midst of an election right now, but that's certainly top of mind, as is the tariffs and the trade wars and the fact we're a border state with Canada. Are those issues kind of coming onto your radar? Is your office, has there a nexus there? Anything that sort of comes to mind on either of those issues?
Well, we're certainly tracking them. Just because we don't bring a case doesn't mean we're not engaged. And I would agree that election security remains really, really important. But across a wide spectrum of different issues, the president is making wide, sweeping cuts that don't just damage the state, in this sort of amorphous entity. They damage people. We sued to stop the cuts to NIH, for example, not because we wanted to simply defend the University of Washington or Washington State, but we want to defend the people that are benefited from those programs, both the jobs that are associated with that work and research, but the people who benefit from it. And across so many different agencies, we're seeing things that I think will be harmful. We saw just a few days ago when they made cuts at the Department of Energy, including people that work on nuclear security. They're doing because they're fairly reckless in their approach, because they don't understand government and the work. So we need to monitor those issues and make sure that we're mindful of the impacts. And even if we're not bringing cases, figure out ways that we can help support people that are benefit from those programs.
Is there any part of you that thinks that the kinds of things this president are doing are the things that a majority of American voters wanted, that they wanted somebody to come in and be a bull in a china shop and really shake things up? And
yeah. Well, I think people wanted someone to shake things up, right? And that sounds good. And there are times, as a proud Democrat, where I want people to shake things up, where the status quo doesn't feel good anymore. I don't think people anticipated the scope and the breadth of conduct that this president has taken. And people also always want those things to happen to other people. I was reading some comments the other day in an article about a supporter of President Trump who supported what he was doing, except when it came to the Veterans Affairs Administration, which benefited him and his family. And so it's easy to think about it in the abstract, that if you're cutting these agencies that don't impact me, then it's okay. But so much of what the president is doing impacts millions and millions of people, and that's why we should be very attentive to what he's doing.
Okay. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we will continue our interview with Attorney General Nick Brown, and we'll talk about some of the other work of the Attorney General's office. Back right after this.
Watch all of TVW's award-winning shows on your time at tvw.org.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Attorney General Nick Brown. And let's talk about some of the other, maybe the bread and butter of your office, which is, as you mentioned, the Trump lawsuits get a lot of attention, but much of what is going on in your office has nothing to do with those. I've got a list here of 17 things that sort of under the auspices of the AG's office, everything from open government, environmental justice, human trafficking, vulnerable adult abuse, legislative priorities. Of course, a lot of what's going on is defending or representing state agencies. But as you think about your first month and some days in office, besides these lawsuits, what else has been occupying your time? How are you approaching these first 100 days and prioritizing?
Yeah, there's both the external piece of the work that we're doing for our clients and on behalf of the public, and there's the internal piece of how do you run a massive agency, and a massive agency that has had the same attorney general for the last 12 years. There are many people that work in the AG's office that have only worked for AG Ferguson, and so there's a transition anytime there's a change in leadership. And in addition to me, there's most of my leadership team is new. And there's a lot of things internally where I'm just focused on getting to know the office and having them get to know me. And so I'm spending a lot of time. We just finished our first all-staff virtual meeting where we had 1,200 people show up on a Zoom or Teams.
And it didn't crash it?
No, it worked really well, actually. But I think people were really excited about it because, sometimes the AG can feel kind of disconnected from everyone else. We have 13 offices across the state and almost 1,900 people. So I'm spending my first few weeks getting to know the office, sharing a lot about me and my priorities, and traveling around to meet with people. I'm headed to Spokane and Tacoma soon, and getting across the state to introduce myself. So there's a lot of just learning that I have to do. But then there's the external piece of the work that we're doing on behalf of our clients and the work we're doing on behalf of the people. We are somewhat of a unique agency in the country. We are the only AG's office in the country where all of state government is represented exclusively by the AG's office. We can hire outside counsel, but we bring them in as special assistant AGs. In almost every other state, agencies could hire directly private law firms. So the Department of Transportation, for example, could hire some law firm to represent them, or they would have their internal lawyers. So we're a little bit different in that regard. But there's so much work that we're doing that I'm just trying to provide big picture leadership and guidance and provide some structure to how decisions are made. But I'm really focused on how we keep the agency involved in the larger public safety work that we're doing. A lot of people think of the Attorney General as sort of a law enforcement agency. Yep. We're really not, at least not in the traditional sense. We have a very, very small number of criminal cases that we do. But I've asked the agency to find ways to be more engaged, working with prosecutors and law enforcement to take on more of that responsibility with their acceptance and help.
The idea being you could come in and support these agencies.
Yeah. We don't have original jurisdiction over that many types of cases.
But if they could use your help or assistance,
and we've tried to communicate that early and often that we want to do more than we have done traditionally as an agency. So I look forward to doing that. But also under the guise of public safety, the things that make that lasting and sustainable are things like healthcare and education and jobs that keep people employed. And there are a lot of those things that we do as an agency that can help support the larger public safety work. So that's a big piece of what we're focused on. There are things that we want to do, as we were touching on earlier, that just get to that day-to-day, like how are people's lives? Like, it's an expensive place to live. People are worried about housing prices. They're worried about business-related practices. And so we can do things, I think, in those areas through our consumer protection work, through our affirmative litigation work, to make this just a better place to live for people and a safer and healthier place to live. And then there's a sort of third bucket in my mind of things that make Washington unique. Like, we have a unique set of values and priorities. Not everybody agrees on all those things, but we are differently situated than Idaho to our east or Oregon to our south. And so we need to find ways to step up and defend and advocate for those values. And that can show up in our affirmative work and our defensive work sometimes. And then we have, we're in the middle of a legislative session. We have a legislative agenda. We have a policy team that does a lot of work on behalf of the public around organized retail theft, around missing and murdered Indigenous people, around the AI task force work that we're doing. And so across the 1,900 or so people that work in the AG's office, we're doing so many different types of things, and it's exciting to get to know that work. But I'm really focused on how we best serve the public, and there's a lot to do.
Are there any changes that you're already contemplating making to the way that this office functions, the way it's structured?
There will be some. I'm not here to make any new announcements, but at least from the outside, you look and you have a lot of questions about why are things organized or run a certain way. Sometimes they make more sense once you get in there and look under the hood a little bit. But I think there are both sort of cultural changes or perspectives that I want to bring just to make sure people are connected to the work that we're doing internally. And then there's some priorities that I'd really like to do around labor and worker protections in particular. We have a great division that does work with L&I at the state level, but that is a common issue that I heard during the campaign is about people concerned about wage theft and worker safety issues. And so there's things there that might be new in structure or how we prioritize those in the agency. But I don't want to make any sweeping changes in my first few weeks in office because I do think it's an incredibly high-functioning office across the board.
And do you, we think of attorneys general in the context of affirmative litigation against the tobacco industry back in the, I guess that would have been the 90s. Still going. Certainly the opioid crisis spawned a lot of affirmative litigation. Is there something besides the president, that you were sort of eyeing that might be the next area of or subject of kind of multi-state litigation that one state's going to probably kick off and other states will join?
There's not one single one. I think there's a handful of issues that I'm thinking about, and I know colleagues in other states are thinking about, some of which are fairly bipartisan. I've had some good conversation with both Democrat and Republican AGs around the tech industry, in particular, impact on kids. There's a lot of concerns that AGs have reflecting the public's concern about the types of information and access kids are getting on social media and that kind of thing, and about whether there's right safety protocols in place across the tech industry there. So that's something that we're thinking about. It doesn't necessarily need to be litigation. It could be policy legislation. It could be collaboration with businesses to solve those problems.
And there's already a lot of litigation that's happened against the tech industry, as well as ongoing investigations.
And there's a lot of ways that we can solve problems, and it doesn't necessarily need to be in a courtroom. We need to be bold in doing that where appropriate, but that's something we're thinking a lot about. To AG Ferguson's credit, when he was AG, he built and created an environmental enforcement division that didn't exist before. Not every state prioritizes that in the same way, but I want to make sure that we're aggressively defending our natural resources for future generations, and so there's more work in that space. I'm really focused on healthcare issues and access, and how we use the tools of the office to make sure that that is a priority. The one area that might be a little new that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about and asking the team to work on is housing-related issues. That's a huge priority across the state. It's obviously a big part of the governor and the legislative's work. The AG's office hasn't traditionally been super engaged in that work, either through litigation or other tools, but it is something that I've heard across the state from people about concern about access to housing, affordability, and I want to make sure that we're using tools to make sure that business practices are best serving the public, and so we're thinking a lot about those issues. And we also need to be responsive to the public. Like, I've got a lot of ideas, but my job is to serve all of Washington. And so we want to be an agency that's accessible to people, and so if someone in a small town in upstate Washington or eastern Washington or down near Oregon, if they have a concern about something that's impacting them, we want to be responsive to that. And so we need to keep an open mind about how we shift our affirmative priorities.
You mentioned the AI task force, which is, I think, mostly looking at policy proposals. But I know that attorneys general are concerned about how AI is being used and algorithms are being used in the context of employment, healthcare, housing. Have you started to think at all about price fixing, algorithmic price fixing, rental housing, market being set by algorithms, and then whether there might be discrimination baked into that, and how an attorney general could take enforcement action and protect people in that space?
Well, yes is the short answer. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but yes, both my office, other AG's offices, and some of our federal partners are looking very closely at those issues. Part of the reason that we have somewhat of a housing crisis in Washington is the nationalization of the housing market and what that might do for consumers, tenants, renters, and buyers. And AI technology or algorithms that can is a tool for some of those problems to exist and develop. So we want to make sure that we are using our agency through our Consumer Protection Act principally to make sure that we're going after that, or the Antitrust Division. The AG's office doesn't have direct jurisdiction over Landlord-Tenant Act or landlord-tenant issues, although we have expanded some of our work in that space. But it is a real concern of mine that technology will be used for abusive practices. It's also a real benefit in many ways, and I'm not anti-tech, and I see a lot of advantages in AI, and I see a lot of advantages in some of the new and emerging technologies that we're seeing in Washington. We've got some great companies here leading a lot of that work, but we need to be very mindful of the negative impacts as well, and so it's something that we're spending a lot of time on.
I want to go back to youth online safety. You have an AG request bill that addresses algorithmic feeds, addictive feeds, the role of parents, and borrows from laws that have passed in other states, including California. What prompted you to make this AG request legislation? What is it, the fact that you are a parent? What is the motivation here to make this one of your priority policy bills for this session?
Well, we wanted to keep our legislative agenda fairly narrow. Brand new as Attorney General, new legislative director, new team, and I didn't want to be overly ambitious in the legislation that we were sponsoring. We help and support and work on a lot of different issues, but decided to make this a priority in part because of some work that had preceded me in the office to look at this issue, the concern that we heard from constituents across the state about their own worry about these issues with respect to their children. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of those areas where there's a lot of bipartisan agreement about this being a priority, not only here in Washington, but amongst my colleagues. I went to a conference in December with the National AGs Association, and online safety issues was one of the big topics of conversation because of the bipartisan concern that we're having. And I also have 2 kids, and I worry about their access to these sorts of things. And I have seen how quickly my kids have got addicted to some of these things. And it can be all-consuming. And so, we want to support technology that provides this opportunity, but provides protection for our kids. And we've seen a lot of negative impacts on kids who don't have safeguards around them. We saw a lot of that, particularly during COVID, where people were more isolated and really focused on small screens in front of their faces. So that's why we've made it a priority. We had a hearing on that bill today, actually. I'm optimistic that the legislature will pass it, and it's a real priority for me.
You well know the tech industry has sued to block a lot of the state level laws around youth online safety, including 2 of the California laws that this is sort of modeled on. Yep. What is how did your team take into account sort of the potential constitutional pitfalls here, and what gives you confidence, if you have it, if this passes, that it would withstand court challenge?
Well, our bill is similar to what was adopted in California and subject to litigation there. It is different, I think, in some important ways. And so we're responsive to that. We're also listening to the tech industry. We may not always agree on their perspective or their opposition to this online safety bill, but we need to be open-minded and listen to their concerns, some of which I think are well-founded, some I don't think are. But I think that if the legislature adopts the bill that we've introduced, which I think addresses those concerns, it'll be successful. And doesn't mean the tech industry won't sue, but I've got a great team. I'm not afraid of that.
Let's stick just with the legislative agenda for a moment. What else is on? You said you were trying to keep it pretty narrow for this first year, but what else are you prioritizing?
We have a bill that deals with supervision for sexually violent predators that would increase, in my view, some of the safeguards around that. That is a harder bill to navigate, but I think it would provide some really important protections going forward. We're weighing in on a new bill that would provide for more penalties for environmental crimes. There are a number of bills in the criminal justice area that would impact Washington and impact the AG's office specifically. There's an effort to create an independent prosecutor. I think the current iteration is to put that office in the governor's office. There's a bill that—
Do you have a position on that specifically, especially in the context of supporting the work of the new office, well, not so new, Office of Independent Investigations, which has just stood up its first team to investigate police deadly force incidents? Do you think in order for that to work, you need to have an independent office of prosecution?
I think having an office of independent prosecution is a good idea. I think it provides for more trust in the community. I think ultimately it provides a benefit to law enforcement agencies as well, because the community has more trust in the work that they're doing. There's a lot of debate about where such an office should live, whether it should be in the AG's office or the governor's office, and I'll leave the legislature to decide that ultimately. But I think ultimately it's a good idea. Similarly, there's an office or a bill that would create a authority within the AG's office to review pattern or practice investigations.
Similar to what US DOJ does.
Similar to what they traditionally do. This administration is not going to do that work, and that's part of—
So is that what's motivating this legislation, to sort of have the state step into that role?
Some proposal has been around for a few years now. I think the urgency of it is a reflection that the Trump administration is unlikely to do very much work in this space. And I don't want to move past that too quickly. The Department of Justice was created specifically to defend people's civil rights. In the wake of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that's why the agency was created. The Trump administration has said pretty explicitly that they don't intend to do very much civil rights work. which is a real abdication of their duty in my mind. But it does create more of a need for the AG's office to step into that void. So we have a great civil rights team that's funded by the legislature to do that work. I want to make sure that we continue to do that work on behalf of the public. And things like pattern and practice investigations would help fill that void, I think.
Jim Bruner in the Seattle Times, moving on to another topic here, Jim Bruner in the Seattle Times recently wrote a piece about the state's growing payouts on tort and lawsuits against state agencies. And most of these payouts are because of settlements, not jury awards. The numbers he used, $500 million over the past 2 years to settle lawsuits. Of that, $370 million from one agency alone, Department of Children, Youth, and Families. From July to December of last year, it was $261 million in payouts. This has been growing over time, but really it seems, skyrocketed over the past 2 years. What, coming in to this role as Attorney General and seeing these trend lines, and the state has waived sovereign immunity. I mean, we can be sued, and it's the deep pocket pays, and as I said, many of these lawsuits are settled. What is your thought on sort of the opportunity or the obligation to try to curb what's becoming quite a large line item in the budget here?
Well, I think the line out in the budget is really important, but to me it's secondary to each of those cases represents an allegation and often a reality that someone has been harmed.
And often, I mean, we're talking about vulnerable people, children, people with developmental disabilities,
absolutely.
People who've been.
And so the budget implications are very important. They're important to our bottom line. They're important to our ability to provide services for other people. But I think the higher problem is, how do we reduce harm as a state? And you're right, we have some unique liability laws here in Washington that are not apparent in every state. But when someone sues a state agency for allegations of negligence involving our care and oversight of a child or someone who's vulnerable or someone who's in our care and custody in the Department of Corrections, we need to make sure that we reduce those from happening to begin with. And I highlight that because of centering people is really important. But also, I view that the job of the Attorney General's office is not only to litigate cases, but to help their client agencies reduce harm. Lawyers are often very well positioned working with their clients to see through lines, common problems. And part of my message
patterns and practices.
Yeah,
right?
Well, part of my message is my team is not just to simply handle that one case in front of them, but to be able to work with their agencies to say, why are you continuing to have these types of cases? What are your programs, policies, procedures, whatever? How are those increasing the likelihood? And so we've seen...
Any good attorney working with their client is trying to reduce their exposure to litigation.
Yeah, but it's not always the case that they're empowered to weigh in that way. Ultimately, lawyers provide advice to clients. Yeah. Clients need to make decisions. Yeah. But we also need to provide advice in an affirmative way that gives them more insight to what we're seeing as their lawyers. And I hope that we can continue to grow that work. But so people, the work of our agency, and at the end of the day, when we lose or we have to settle a case, we're doing so, settling because we think it's in the best interest of the public. But that is having a real budget impact. And so we've got to find a way to reduce that harm from happening, to make sure that we're not harming people, but also reducing the fiscal impact to the state.
I know Attorney General Rob McKenna, when he was in office, proposed some tort reform efforts. Deb Eddy, who is a longtime Democratic state lawmaker, wanted some changes made to create a little bit more protection for the state on having to be the deep pocket. Do you see any opportunity for changing the rules of the road, maybe limiting the state's exposure going in the door?
Well, I think we should always be willing to have those conversations about how do we reduce harm to the people that are impacted, and how do we reduce the budget impacts. I have not yet, in my month and 2 days in the office, had those conversations with people, but I would never foreclose having those conversations. I'm a big believer that people who are harmed need to have their opportunity to have their cases heard. I think that is really foundational for our success as a state. But I'm mindful of the impacts that we're facing here in Washington, and we should always have those conversations.
What about your office's budget? I know there was some, the governor has asked agencies for 6% across the board cuts. So first off, does that apply to your agency?
It doesn't
even though you're
apply
independently-
technically because I don't work for the
independently
governor.
elected,
but
yeah.
we did go through
You
that
did.
and submitted materials to the governor.
So, okay, so what does that look like for your agency?
Well, it'll be public. I know Governor Ferguson is committed to sharing publicly what all agencies did. And we tried to explain how that money would be cut and what the impacts would be. And there are a lot of different, I don't want to get too far down in the budget weeds here, but there's a lot of different buckets of money, right? We get affirmative litigation, which generates money for the state. One thing to keep in mind for the public is that I think the AG's office is the only revenue generating agency in state government. Like, we raise money on behalf of the public through our affirmative work. But we tried to demonstrate in a handful of areas, if we had to cut 6%, what that would mean. And it would have some pretty serious impacts. And I know the legislature is having a tough debate in the weeks ahead about, do we make cuts? Do we raise revenue? Do we do some combination? But it would have an impact on the types of services that we can provide for people.
And there was also some talk of sweeping some funds from consumer protection lawsuit settlements that are in your office, I guess, into the general fund to help address this budget crisis. What's that conversation been like with the now governor and
Sure.
former attorney general?
Well, Governor Ferguson made a budget proposal. I made public my opposition to that cut. It would be more than half of our operating budget for the affirmative work around civil rights, environmental enforcement, consumer protection. That is work that mostly impacts people directly, and I would hate to see that work cut. Understanding that we have some real budget constraints to work with. We've put out directives to our team to find ways to save money. We've cut back on trainings and travel and all these things that I think are normally really helpful for the agency, but we want to be mindful of that. We're not hiring new people currently beyond the leadership team replacements that we've done. But we have some real personnel needs that we need to address. So, the legislature got a tough decision about how we fund some of these holes, but I would really hate to see that good work be underfunded.
Just a couple minutes left. What's something we haven't talked about that's on your mind or that you're thinking about, either short-term or long-term? And obviously, again, this wasn't just a ease into this job kind of first 100 days. You've been in the news, you've been busy, but as you think about, you've got a 4-year term here. You've had some really interesting roles. I mean, as the former governor's general counsel, as U.S. attorney, as an attorney in private practice, and now as a statewide AG. Kind of where else are you going with this? What else are you thinking about in terms of your priorities?
Right now, we were talking before we started today. Like, I think I've been on your show a few times. I think this is my 3rd role that I've been on your show in.
We've tracked your career,
which might be a little bit unique. Years and years ago, before I went to law school, I was an intern at the AG's office with AG Gregoire. So it was between my senior year in college and first year in law school. And I would never have guessed then, watching AG Gregoire speak and getting an opportunity to work with the AG's office then, that I would one day be in this position. And I think if you look at my career path, it's not a straight line. There's been so many great jobs and opportunities that I've had, and I'm 30-something days into being AG. It's a pleasure to do the work, and mostly because the work matters. And I know sometimes it's hard to see what people in elected office do, but every day I get to come to work and do things that matter, that impact people's lives, that can help try to improve people's lives. Not everyone always agrees with the decisions that I'm making or the team is making, but there's nothing that I'm doing that is irrelevant on a day-to-day basis, and that's a unique opportunity. So I'm going to cherish this time and try to make the best of it and create the best law firm possible for Washington. And that's, I think, principle number one moving forward.
And just very briefly, because we are in such polarized times, I mean, your tone and tenor is evident here, but how are you going to try to navigate in terms of how you? Well, what kind of leadership do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. When I first got elected in November, some of the first calls I made were to the Republican caucus chairs in the legislature. I met yesterday with the head of the Republican Senate caucus. I'm meeting tomorrow with the House Republicans. They may not agree or like with them of the things I'm doing, but I want to make sure that we're accessible to them in the same way we would be anybody else. And that's my perspective going forward.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Attorney General Nick Brown, thanks for the hour.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Good to talk to you. We will check back in with you. We'll have you back
See you
on.
soon.
Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.